Welcome to the Policy Insights Forum Strategic Thinkers Series. I'm Paul Taillon. The subject to be explored today is an assessment of the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict. To provide their observation and assessments, we are hosting two notable experts in the field of defense. Firstly, the Honorable Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie, retired. Joe Varner is a past adjunct scholar at West Point's Modern War Institute and is author of Canada's Asia-Pacific Security Dilemma. So let's start. We've been seeing a lot of interesting press lately, and I would like to pose to these two gentlemen, how do you assess the status of the ongoing Ukraine offensive? Joe, may you start?
Yeah, I guess what I would say, Paul, is that from my perspective, we're not really any further ahead at this point than we were some months ago. I mean, both the Russians and the Ukrainians are no close to winning this war. Both have strategic objectives that they have not been able to attain. I would say that, right now the initiatives with the Ukrainians and the Russians are on the defensive, and every once in a while they'll counterpunch. But right now we're waiting for the Ukrainian offensive to be able to break through the Russian front lines, and we're not seeing that. And neither side right now wants to negotiate, and this looks very much like it could end like all the other border conflicts along the former Soviet Union as a frozen war.
General, your views?
I'm not saying it's being done, but let's not underestimate the extraordinary competence of the Ukraine soldier and their remarkably brilliant generalship. And consider what they had to go through since 2014. They've learnt in the crucible of battle. I fully agree with Joe that over the last couple of weeks, it doesn't look as if much is going on. But let me quickly sort of turn the page of time back a month or two. And the Ukraine army was waiting for the training and, of course, the equipment they required to conduct a counteroffensive of any scale and meaning. That has all been delivered. And despite the intensity of the essentially stalled battles now, it's only stalled in the sense that the Ukraine army tried some bounce crossings of complex obstacles, and those didn't work. So instead of needlessly pushing forward, what they've done is husband their ultra-scarce resources, which is trained person power. They've kept their main striking force about 100 kilometers back, roughly. We don't know exactly where they are, and even if we did, we wouldn't tell you. And they're getting ready to exploit when the inevitable moment comes when they've made sufficient breaches in the complex obstacle to do that which they've got to do.
This conflict has returned the Cold War perception of conventional war described as steel against steel. Where do you see the ISR, or intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability in this conflict rate?
The whole idea of being able to find your foe before he can find you has existed since time immemorial. And when I was a young soldier, what we used to do is something called advance to contact. You knew the bad guy was out there somewhere, but your job was to get out of your vehicles, have them tucked in behind you, and essentially proceed on foot until you bumped into the enemy, who was usually dug in, and whoever did the bumping into would suffer casualties, which is why you had to have a certain degree of mass, lots of artillery to suppress the enemy, and lots of air defense systems, and the list goes on and on and on. What we're now seeing are two modern contemporary adversaries essentially struggling to gain a technological advantage using a variety of tools so that they can see the ground, trace the patterns of life, pick up the thermal detection, using thermal detection, pick up where the vehicles are, what type of vehicles by their infrared signature, where they've been through delayed and matching photography of the terrain features taken by the drones or whatever system is being used. And it's quite something, especially for the rest of us watching from afar. Be warned, all of us, if you don't have dominance using the technologies that are in use by the Ukraine today, and increasingly Russia, beware, because you won't win.
Joe, you've been monitoring this for quite some time. You've been writing on a daily basis. How have you seen ISR develop during this time period?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything the general said. If we don't get our hands on ISR, like we're seeing right now in Ukraine and with Russia, we're going to be in a real difficult spot if we have to go into battle. The fact of the matter is, the technology that's out there right now, when it's coupled with AI and targeting, is going to make the modern battlefield very, very messy. And, commanders are now seeing the battlefield in real time. And I'll give you another perspective. Decision makers at the grand strategic level are seeing the battlefield in real time on social media and tools like that. Which I think is causing them to ask a lot of questions about what is going on in the battlefield. And it's probably complicating decision making, and they're probably sticking their nose in where I think generals would rather that politicians not stick their nose in. But given what we're seeing now and what's available just on a daily basis, open source, the ISR is incredible.
How effective are the Russian forces in the defense, and what is your views as to why?
You should never underestimate your foe. I'm not saying the Ukraine have done so, far from it. They have a deep understanding of the Russian mind, and they themselves have had bitter combat experience earned the hard way since 2014. Having said that, the fashion of the Russian defense is highly reminiscent of the prepared defenses they engaged in during the Second World War, even the first. Maybe not to the extremes of the trench warfare, but pretty close. Static positions, well dug in, reinforced by triple layers of minefields, repeated time after time after time, such that some of the minefield depths, in other words, the amount of ground that the Ukraine army has to penetrate to get clear of the mines, is estimated to be as high as 15 to 20 kilometers. With literally millions of mines buried because they've had time to prepare over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 months. So that's the first point. The second point is the Russian soldier is by his nature or her nature not as advanced, not as quick thinking, not as reactive, and not as well informed as to what's going on around them. Nor do they have the same levels of initiative that's been inculcated into the Ukraine army with the assistance of NATO allies, but certainly of their own volition and experience. What that means is that if you give a Russian soldier a relatively simple task, defend this series of ditches and holes, and by the way, we'll kill you ourselves if you withdraw, he'll probably stay there and fight. In turn, the Russians have enormous numbers of old-style artillery, and they position those guns appropriately, 5 to 10 kilometers behind the Russian front lines. As the Ukraine army attempts to engage in penetrative activities to punch through those lanes, they're sitting targets for the mass Russian artillery. So the Ukraine has decided to go slow and careful and do most of its work at night, keeping that strike force, that mailed fist, well poised for whatever happens next.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians have I won't say it's an easy task, but it's an easier task than the Ukrainians have, which is, one, they have to break in the front and get through those minefields that the general was talking about and the obstacles. And then they've got to have their forces come through and exploit that breach. They're playing with, from what I understand, about 12 brigades over a 900 kilometer front. And, 9 of those brigades are Western equipped and Western trained. 3 of them are still with old Russian style equipment. But, they're up against what has been a fairly competent, well, actually, I'm not going to put it that way. The Russians on the offensive have been terrible. It's been nothing short of a disaster. And we've seen about 8 Russian generals purged because of it. But they've proven themselves to be pretty competent on the defense to date. They've had time. The Ukrainians don't have the air power that they need, and they don't have some of the enablers that they need. And so, as the general said, they're taking their time. It's getting through and breaking through. And I mean, today we saw a little bit of movement around Bakhmut. It looks like, they're using a pincer movement to try and break through there. And if they can get behind Bakhmut, they might have an opportunity to move into open country, it doesn't seem to be as well defended as their southern section, and they're working on the hinge there, just below Donetsk and Zaporizhia. My Ukrainian's not that good, but I think if they can break the link there, they'll have some advantages too. Right now, though, they're stuck in these mines, and we'll see what cluster munitions do. Whether the cluster munitions give them some leverage.
So what lessons can we draw from this conflict, in your view, Joe, so far?
I think the biggest lesson for me has been information control. I'm absolutely amazed at the Ukrainians' ability to control the flow of information so that we know everything about the Russians and very little, if anything, about the state of the Ukrainian military or their casualties. They've done a masterful job of information warfare. We've seen the Russians try and play the game, and they've had some successes, but not to the level that the Ukrainians have been able to control the narrative here. And I think that's a big lesson of this conflict. The other thing I would say is we're seeing night vision equipment that the Ukrainians have are giving them an enormous advantage over the Russians in nighttime operations. And we haven't seen that completely play out yet, but that's one of the things that I think is very valuable. And drones. The Russians are sending about 18 suicide drones a night at Ukrainian targets. Some get through and some don't. But the ones that do get through to their targets, and we're seeing the Ukrainians, do similar things to Russian formations. They are able to destroy targets that are much more valuable than the drone itself, and it's been quite impressive to watch what is the advent of drone warfare, and we're seeing it at sea and on land and in the air, in different types. So I would say the drones are here to stay.
General, your views as to lessons so far?
Well, I'd like to build on Joe's excellent framework and ratchet it up to the strategic level just for a second. One thing that's become readily apparent is it's very difficult to predict when future wars, or the one that's going on now, might occur. So it's essentially a come-as-you-are war. There's not going to be a 5 or 10 year advance warning time with sabers being rattled hither and yon to allow industries and governments, most especially, to kick into sort of a war footing mentality, as we saw during the Second World War and, of course, the First World War. The potential for not being ready is Armageddon. The potential for getting it wrong could be the destruction of us all. So it behooves governments, responsible governments, to have a balance between strategic assets and assets which can deter an enemy. Canada does not. And it's I'm just going to use an extraordinarily rude word. It is appalling, the state of readiness that the Canadian Force find themselves in. That is not their fault. That is the fault of a government which is underfunded or promised money to be spent on defense, but somehow never got round to the fact, to the tune where the current Liberal government has not spent $19 billion that was promised in Strong, Secure, Engaged as of 2015 until now. Last year alone, the Minister of National Defense, assisted by her Deputy Minister, handed back in $4 billion. And this year, they've already informed Treasury Board that a further $4 billion will not be required. At a time when the readiness, the ability to deploy with effective, credible deterrence from the Canadian Forces is and has been never lower in the previous, ready for this, 50 to 60 years. So shame on all those senior leaders involved, both political, bureaucratic, and those generals and admirals who allowed it to happen and we didn't see them resign, bluntly. So let's now talk at the operational level. There's a bunch of folk who have a variety of opinions on equipment types and their view of the next evolving stage of warfare, or if you would, the techniques and tactics. I think this war has proven that it behooves you to have a robust Air Force that can do the job under a high threat environment. It behooves you to have a capable Navy that can operate above and below the surface and is ready to go at a moment's notice with quantities that are effective in deterring and fighting, staying alive if required. You also need within an army a combined arms team. And every decade or so, there's a huge push to get rid of the tank. Until you talk to people who've been shot at and kind of wish they had a modern tank and its protective abilities around them. Don't forget, the main role of the tank, firepower, shock action, mobility, but it's also protection for the crews. That's why the Ukraine has been so patiently waiting for the hundreds of NATO tanks to arrive, because of their high protective levels. And the same is true of armored personnel carriers. Got to be able to fight and move for them, but you also got to get out. But they have to be contemporary, they have to be modern. You need integrated and long-range precision strike, so not just normal artillery, but rocket artillery. You need air defense systems, of which the Canadian Army currently has, you ready for this? Zero. None. We are the only army that I'm aware of in the world that has no air defense system, which is integral to the Army. We have no short range, no medium, no long range, and we need all three. We have no technologically capable drone system integrated in our intelligence, surveillance, and target acquisition matrix. In other words, the sum total of the traditional tools to find out what's going on now layered on top of drones. And there's no apparent embracing of this technology by not the armed forces, who are keener than mustard to get it done, but it's by essentially the bureaucracy, by the elected officials who have failed to provide the funding. Saying the defense system is broken for 8 years is getting a bit tiresome, as our allies are starting to tell us. On top of that, you need a capable and dedicated engineer force, which can breach complex obstacles, which we're now seeing in Ukraine, on Ukraine territory anyways, by the Russians. Can all do other stuff, but his main job is just that. You also need reconnaissance assets, both manned and unmanned. Ergo, the drone theory and the drone tools and technologies start to apply. All of it has to be communicated in a high threat environment. So you need advanced communications architectures, electronic warfare, electronic support, and counter jamming. You need robust logistics, trucking systems, which are armored, be able to deliver combat supplies, ammunition, water, food, and of course, fuel. You also need medical systems, which are well forward and able to protect themselves, given air defense and local protective forces, but to triage their patients quickly so you can have a greater number survive. And the Ukraine have done a fantastic job in that regard. By the way, the Russians have not. And the disproportionate figures that die amongst the Russian army after even a relatively modest wound is staggering. So where am I going with all this? We kind of need more of what the type of army we have now, but with new technologies. And beware, either a bureaucrat or a general or admiral or someone else, especially elected officials, who say, gosh, I don't think we need this thing next time around. Because every time that has happened in the last 50 to 60 years, they have been wrong. And the so what of that is Canada right now is not contributing a proportional share of defense according to our 40 million population, our $2.1 trillion GDP. We're just not. We have 800 people in Latvia and 21 on United Nations missions right now. So beware. Beware those who don't prepare for war. Beware those who will cut military budgets while the Russian bear is rampaging in Europe and China is rustling its scales. That's what I call a rant.
Is this becoming a modern war of attrition in your views, Joe?
Yeah, I would just like to say what the general just said. Yeah, this is a modern war of attrition so far. I mean, that may change. But right now it is a war of attrition, and I think there's a danger that both sides could bleed themselves white if they're not careful. We just saw the Russians do that. And I think if you're looking at the way the Ukrainians have engaged them in the kind of the central part the eastern part of the front line around Donetsk and Luhansk. They're actually pulling in the best units that we've seen the Russians field so far in their airborne forces, and they're taking casualties, which is interesting. It looks like the Ukrainians are purposely drawing them in. And the Russian airborne forces are in a sense, they're in some disarray. A number of their better commanders have just been fired or arrested or removed. So it's certainly looking like a war of attrition. It's been so far to date. I mean, you look at fighting from 2014 in Donetsk and Luhansk. It's been certainly more of a war of attrition. There hasn't been much maneuver. We've seen some attempts at maneuver here in the last year, but they've ended in kind of pitched slugging matches. So I would say it is a war of attrition. That may change. We'll see what happens if the Ukrainians get through the Russian minefields. They get a little bit of maneuver under their belts with that striking force that the general's talking about, that they've been holding back. We may see a different war, but right now, war of attrition.
General, your views?
As we know, war is a continuation of politics by other means. So at the strategic level, time, unfortunately, is not on Ukraine's side. Ukraine has a superb army who are literally fighting for hearth and home. Their families are literally just behind them. And in all cases, are trying to reclaim territory that was unlawfully taken by Russia, and on whose territory the Russians are committing atrocities against the Ukraine who've been left behind, i.e. the women and children that are now finding themselves under Russian rule temporarily. That's why the Ukraine is fighting so hard. They've shown remarkable skill and perseverance. We've already talked about their superb generalship. But even if the exchange and casualty ratio is 6 or 7 to 1 in favor of Ukraine, they're still going to lose sooner than the Russians will. And the Russians don't care about their casualties, frankly. Mm-hmm. The generals and Putin and his gang of oligarchs could care less. Ukraine cares very deeply about the casualties, right from the private soldier, the mother, the father, the wife, the husband, right up to the top and across the entire spectrum of the society. As well, at the strategic level, there's doubt that NATO and certain NATO allies will stay the course for much more than 2, 3, 5, certainly 10 years would be pushing it. Why? Because it's having an impact, a negative impact on their economies and their quality of life, on their access to markets through fragility in the supply chain, and they can fall prey to propaganda from either Russia, China, or Belarus, or wherever it may originate. That's another sort of pressure on the Ukraine to not let Russia have the time. And the third reason is at the tactical level, a lot of stupid Russians have been killed. Inevitably, they will find ones who know what they're doing on the battlefield. And those survivors of the school of battle, will get better, and they'll inculcate around themselves an increased professionalism, which will not bode well for the Ukraine. So pressure and time is mounting on the Ukraine to resolve this current offensive, but they can't rush to failure, which they would be doing if they were to precipitously launch their full reserve attack force until the breaches are complete and the political constructs are appropriate. Let's not forget, this war is being fought for political objectives. So the president of Ukraine has to decide at what point is it worth risking his fighting force, his elite, because if it doesn't work, he's in trouble, and so is Ukraine.
Some analysts have argued that technology has dramatically changed the battlefield. If so, does mass in personnel and material still count?
Part of me wants to say that a general today is concerned the same way that a Russian or a Roman general was, some 1,000+ years back. How much can a soldier carry? How far can they go, and can they fight when they get there? And so I guess my view is that in the air and at sea, you have to have the very best equipment. Numbers do count, but you have to have the very best equipment. There's no second best in the sky or on the water. You either have the best or you're dead. On land, you can have a degree of parity in your equipment with your opponent. But at the end of the day, numbers do matter. And I mean, the general just alluded to it. If you're looking at the Ukrainians and the Russians, there's probably 4 times or 5 times as many Russian troops out there. Maybe 3 or 4 times as many troops out there as there are Ukrainians right now. Russian casualties are about 230,000, and as the general pointed out, a large number of them are dead. The Ukrainians are around 130,000. But in terms of odds, they're almost 1.7 to 1 for the Russians, or sorry, for the Ukrainians right now, and those aren't great odds. They're suffering casualties at almost the rate probably that the Russians are. They're not dying, not as many dying, but because they're getting them to medical services. The Russians have had their field hospitals and their medical services held back. And as the general pointed out, young soldiers are dying of wounds that they probably shouldn't be dying of. But I would say numbers do matter on the ground. And modern equipment is a great equalizer. But numbers do win battles.
Yes, mass and materials still matter, perhaps even more so than in days gone by because of the speed of responses. To go back to Joe's very, very good foundation of the analogy he was building with the Roman legion and a Roman centurion, their supply chain could sometimes extend in terms of time, months to get from point A to point B, or to get resupply of additional soldiers. Nowadays, that can be cut down to a matter of certainly hours, days, maybe weeks in the case of, for example, when the Canadian Armed Forces were in Afghanistan. Getting spare equipment from Canada to Afghanistan would normally take, in terms of a cycle, probably 3 to 4 weeks, even if it was readily available. But mass can be differentiated as compared to times gone by. And yes, we have, by the way, and the equipment is key. I won't belabor that because Joe did a great job in explaining air, land, and sea requirements. I will just make the point that beware of throwing out stuff you think you're never going to need again. Because we've seen now on TV convoys of stuff the Canadian Armed Forces got rid of just a couple of years ago, a decade or so ago, maybe 15, 20 years, being brought back into service because there's a need for it at the front. That's being exchanged with the Ukraine or given to them. So where am I going with the whole idea of a combination of better mass and more quantities of equipment of a higher quality? Well, let's take a look at the Canadian context, for example. Let's bring it down home. Right now, we've got an armed forces of about 100,000, of which about 35,000, maybe 40, is part-time, and the other are full-time, spread between air, land, and sea. Now, the skills demanded of those who serve on our ships and our aircraft is probably, overall, of a higher demand in terms of quality and technological awareness and equipment types than it is in the Army, though don't denigrate the capabilities and requirements needed to fight a land war. But in terms of critical mass, right now we have about 35,000-ish, roughly, reservists. And quite frankly, we could use more, especially in the Army context. People who are available on relatively short notice, freshen up training to go overseas and do that which their country demands of them, because the next war is going to be like the one that's going on now. It's going to be a come as you are. No foe of near peer level, and there's lots of them, especially when you consider how far down Canada's peer rating currently is. But there's lots of armed forces out there which could get their own ambitions, for example, in our Arctic and elsewhere. Now, I'm not suggesting someone from overseas is actually going to invade the Arctic, but they could start drilling there tomorrow. Now, is that an act of war? No, it's not. We have to resolve that ourselves as a sovereign nation, which, by the way, we have no defenses in the North right now, no permanently installed defenses. That's a separate topic. We need more reservists who are adequately trained on contemporary equipment to be able to backstop the Army. Because look what's happening right now. It's taken the Canadian Armed Forces, a $2 trillion economy, ministers that have handed back tons of billions of dollars, over a year and a half to send a squadron of tanks. And they're still not there. We were supposed to be able to provide between 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers within 6 to 8 months. A year and a half has gone by and it hasn't really moved from the 800 we already had positioned. We have no or almost no artillery stocks. Our vehicles have no spare parts, still. So we need to get better and more aware of the impact of stupid decisions made tomorrow to essentially feed the beast of social progress or budget saving at the expense of having a viable armed forces which is representative of its peoples and population, which can do some good. Let's not forget our numbers. Right? Barely 1,000 deployed, less than 25 on peacekeeping missions. What are we doing with it? Well, we're doing stuff at home. Is that really what you want them to do all the time?
As you're aware, the casualty rates and personnel have made an argument for NATO members to incorporate a large reserve force like Finland or Sweden, or see the renewal of conscription amongst its membership. Is this a viable option? And if not, what other options could be implemented to offset numbers?
Well, I don't think that having conscription would work in Canada. The simple reason is it's been tried twice during world wars, and it was more divisive than it was unifying. And very few of those conscripted actually went overseas to fight. And as a former senior leader of within the armed forces, certainly a senior leader of the Army, I would much rather have troops who wanted to be there, who understood the mission and supported it, and were willing to fight for the mission, or perhaps more importantly, for their friends and the buddies that are in the immediate group around them. So I'm not sure that conscription is the correct answer. As a matter of fact, I would probably advise against it, but we do need more numbers. This quality and mass. We need more good people to be allowed to be included in our ranks. And by the way, we could have had them, because as I've said in a previous segment, currently the government is turning back in billions of dollars, which was promised under the 2017 Strong, Secure, Engaged Defense Policy.
My view is the general is absolutely right, and there's no excuse for where we are right now. I think when we were in Afghanistan, we were about 3,000 infantry over establishment, because we had to build up our infantry force, and we relied heavily on reservists. But I think that the Army commander at the time did a masterful job at making sure that we still had a reserve force at the end of the day. And given that we're probably 15,000 people short or ineffective in the Canadian forces, maybe more right now, trying to pull together the numbers that we're supposed to put into Latvia is going to be a real challenge. And the only way to do that is to pull from the reserves. I think there are ways to pull it together to grow the Canadian forces, but we're not seeing those measures taken at this point that I can see anyway. And I mean, I'm not a general, but I think that we could do a number of things to streamline things, everything from security clearances to getting people in uniform and getting them out the door. I mean, we're seeing personnel crises in a number of NATO countries, but Canada's in a category of its own. We're basically, we're in a category of our own. The general's right. Canada, the United States, and Great Britain have had professional standing armies for 50 years that haven't employed conscripts. But you are seeing Europe now look at conscripts again. Germany's having the discussion. France is having the discussion. Netherlands, surprisingly. Latvia, I think, has conscription as of next year in some form. About 6 or 7 NATO countries currently have it. I think you can probably do a lot more with education and bonuses and making life a little more attractive. Good military housing. There are a variety of things that I think you can do and to perk up our numbers. And they cost money, and the general points out we've given money back every year. There's no reason that we can't be doing more to retain people and to recruit people and to make it worth their while.
The impressive multifaceted capability of drones have been observed in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, or better known as the Armenian-AZERBAIJAN War. The conflict in Ukraine has provided a more fulsome appreciation of how this technology has been promulgated and utilized on the battlefield. What does this mean to the validity and survival of the traditional combined arms team and logistical train now and in the future? Will it only see a war dominated by drones? What does this mean to Canada's military procurement requirements? Your views, Joe.
Yeah, I still think the human factor is going to be important in war. And I think that the judgment factor is going to be important in war and the seizing of initiative. And, AI can do an awful lot. I don't know that it's quite there yet. But I mean, drone warfare, when we saw Azerbaijan and Armenia fight it out, we saw different doctrines, different approaches. It seems that the Russians learned a lot from that, but they're not the only ones. A number of countries have been watching what's going on very closely. I mean, the Ukrainians are losing an enormous number of drones every day, 150 or so a day, smaller drones, tactical drones. But they're playing a key part in keeping Ukraine alive in this fight. Russians just announced that they're going to include the operation of combat drones in their grade 11 and grade 12 curriculum to go along with throwing hand grenades, assault rifles, and combat first aid that they brought back in high schools. So, I think that you're going to see drones much more integrated in warfare. One area we haven't seen them do so well so far is subsurface, under the water. But we've certainly seen the Ukrainians use drones to great effect, and the Russians use drones to great effect in the air and on land, and even on top of the sea. Fairly simple drones, assaulting Russian warships. So it's part of the future.
The advantages that are currently and rapidly being introduced into the theater of operations along the Ukraine-Russian combat zones are sort of staggering in terms of their implications, but also in their terms of their direct results. As Joe has very convincingly said, there's thousands of different types of drones and tens of thousands in terms of quantity in the hands of those two militaries. The Russians are learning slowly. They have more societal control over their education system. They have a certain degree of ability for the leader to say, right, we're now going to, learn for combat first aid or how to teach our kids to fly drones. Got all that. Let's watch what the U.S. Army, still the premier army in the world, actually by far the premier army in the world, followed by the second best army in the world, Ukraine. I think the United Kingdom Army is probably in third place now with the recent combat experience of the Ukraine and their amazing ability to integrate different weapon systems and actually get them out the door to win the fight has been remarkable. And let's talk about winning the fight. What they've done is, instead of starting from scratch, they've superimposed this availability of information at the sub-tactical, tactical, operational, and strategic levels into their existing structures. And they've reinforced the usage of the drones by appointing or sending additional people to man them very close, if not at the front line, sometimes in front of the front line. And it's working remarkably well because there isn't sort of an existential angst about where you fit within the combined arms team. The combined arms team is still very much the king of battle. It's just how is the battle fought and what information are you basing on and what systems are you using to draw it in and to collate it. Where the Ukrainians as well, I think, are making breathtaking breakthroughs, assisted by the examples of our US friends, is being able to synthesize all this information and put it out in a usable product to their various long-range strike mechanisms. For example, long-range rocket launchers or aircraft or other drones, by the way. Conventional artillery as well. And that in turn is being further sub-aggregated at battalion and company level, very much tactical, as to where the fire should go next and where the fragile, but you got to do it to win the fight, where your infantry, armor, artillery can coalesce to get the infantry onto the objective. And it's breathtaking in terms of its speed if it's done well, and it's tragic when you run up against something which can stop it cold. So here we have the drones, essentially cutting edge technology, at the very edge of the cutting edge. And you've got a highly experienced army that's run slap dab into millions of mines. Don't forget, wars are political. The political objective, then, is at the forefront of the Ukraine thinking right now. How do we actually get what we want, which is Russia out of Ukraine, while using the technology at all levels of warfare to make sure that we have a viable force after the war is over? Because that's what's important. If you just win and Russia leaves, they're going to come back again in 6 months. How do we know this? Because they've already done it twice recently, and they'll probably try it a third time if the opportunity presents. So you got to think beyond the next bound. But it's an exciting time to be a professional soldier. It's also a worrying time because the world is not going to get any safer over the next couple of years. It'll get more dangerous if nation states that are part of alliances don't contribute to effective deterrence, such as Canada.
How does electronic warfare, EW, impact the war in Ukraine, and what can be done effectively to counter the effects of this technology?
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say is that everybody thought that the Russians would use their EW advantage, and they were considered one of the best players in the field early on in the war to dominate the war with Ukraine, and it looks like they weren't there. There's an army that's got dedicated resources and units that are equipped and trained to play in the EW battlefield. But they're there now. They didn't appear to be there early on. As a matter of fact, the Russians, I think you'll remember the Russians lost a key piece of kit that was supposed to be an intelligence boon for Ukraine and for the West in terms of one of their EW systems. But what we're seeing now is a bit of a different game. The Russians are using EW very well against a variety of targets, one of which is actually drones. And I think the number that I saw here is between 5,000 and 20,000 drones being taken down, some just dropping out of the sky because of EW, 160 every day, which is a pretty impressive number. That also tells you how important drones are, that there are that many out there flying around the battlefield doing business. And I think, we're seeing electronic warfare do everything from manipulate GPS to shutting down people's communications. It's hard to fight a battle when you can't talk to your generals. And again, we saw it early on in the campaign. The Russians took out a number of cell phone towers and then had to rely on cell phones to try and communicate. Not the case right now. Russians seem to be doing pretty well. But what I would say is, to echo some of the points the generals made earlier, we have urgent operational requirements right now for our troops in Latvia that have been out there for some time. Anti-tank, anti-air, and counter-drone. And I think you could probably add to that a good tactical communications system. And without that, Canadian troops in Latvia, in my opinion, are at considerable risk. We're probably closer than we've been in a long time to being dragged into a shooting war in Europe. And the potential here for someone to miscalculate, make a major mistake, and draw NATO and Russia into this fight directly against one another, exists like it probably hasn't since the Berlin Wall. And so I would say that EW is just a key tool in the toolbox today to fight a modern war. And when it gets teamed up with AI, and when it gets teamed up with all the sensors that are out there and that network of sensors, it's going to be a very, very powerful tool in defense and on the offense.
I think Joe was most eloquent. I would just reinforce what he's saying by reminding us of a tiny bit of history. Up until around 25 years ago, the Canadian Armed Forces was a world not necessarily at the cutting edge of the technology, but just one step behind in electronic warfare and classified communications research. Focused mainly on the air and the sea. Whereas, as already been alluded to during our discussion today, that technological edge is such, if you don't have it, you die. It's literally that simple. For the Army in Afghanistan, I would say that the capabilities the Canadian Army had provided by the larger Canadian forces was superb. Surprising to most people because we don't talk about it a lot, but the quality and training of the communications specialists and some of the technologies they were using greatly helped the various commanders of a variety of nationalities and allowed us to do what we had to do. But that has waned. It's sort of ebbed at it's another low point because of this rush to declare a peace dividend. And it's going to take some rebuilding, but it's possible with new threats. And the new threats are here.
We have seen the Ukraine population taking up arms overtly and covertly. Ukraine now has a digitally enabled popular resistance movement supporting intelligence collection, assisting Ukraine special operations, and conducting low-level direct action operations on a scale that would be impossible in past decades. What are the implications of employing these civilians as a covert partisan resistance in military, legal, and political terms?
Well, Colonel Doctor, you've written books on this subject, so I'm kind of reluctant to dabble too deeply into it. I will say that in many cases, Ukraine people are fighting for their lives behind enemy lines which advanced past them. They are doing all that they can to assist the armed forces of Ukraine to evict the Russian invaders. There is definitely partisan activity taking place. I'm sure that drones are involved in not only relaying information, but supplies. But it's also the bravery of the individuals on the ground who are risking their lives and being shot out of hand by the Russians should they catch them. I'm not an expert on this specific aspect of the law of war. I do know that anybody that you detain under all circumstances has to be treated humanely and with respect. And there's no such thing anymore under the laws of war of out and out, just take them outside behind the shed and shoot people. Is that happening by the Russians in Ukraine? It certainly is. And we've seen visible evidence of such on countless video shots from drones of the results of a Russian occupation of towns, villages, and the list goes on.
Yeah, this is a life and death struggle, and the generals said it very, very well. I mean, the Russians have engaged in atrocities, the level of which we haven't seen since the Second World War. And I guess one of the, I mean, you would think the Russians would have learned from their own lessons in the Second World War about partisans and about a population that becomes engaged in the fight. I mean, they're kidnapping Ukrainian children. 20 to 30,000 Ukrainian children have been forcibly taken from their parents, relocated to Russia, and farmed out and adopted by Russians, never to see home probably again. And that has an impact on a population, and we've seen the impact on the population. It's fighting back. I mean, we've seen assassination of military leaders in and outside of Ukraine by Ukrainian special forces and by their agents. We've seen sabotage, rail links, bridges, roadways. We've seen poisonings, ambushes, mayors of local towns being taken out and killed by partisans. This is a bloody, bloody war. And, the fact that the civilian population has been engaged the way it has is not surprising to me. What's surprising to me is that someone who is supposed to be a master of hybrid warfare, like General Gerasimov, the Russian chief of general staff, doesn't seem to have any grasp of the realities of what he's doing in terms of antagonizing the local populations, which are then taking it out on his people. There's no hearts and minds here. This is, a life and death struggle where the Russians want to destroy what is a sovereign state.
What impact do you see from observing this conflict upon future NATO and in particular Canada defense spending?
There's an old saying that you get the army that you deserve. I disagree with that. You get the armed forces that you deserve by working hard, being willing to make sacrifices. So it's understandable in certain contexts that urge to sacrifice, be it a social program or recreational facilities or multiple new hospitals, to sacrifice that sort of infrastructure. But you have to think a bit bigger than the normally self-absorbed region in which most people think about their immediate futures. So it's not just your neighborhood or your town or your country, it's all of us, because the consequences of getting deterrence wrong can be fatal for all of us. Russia has over 7,000 nuclear weapons. China has well over 1,000 by now. They have the weapon systems to deliver them. They can strike our cities at any time should we get it wrong. Well, then the pushback to that is, well, why do we need armed forces at all? Well, for the very reasons such as you see in Ukraine. The implied threat of nuclear weapons has been used by Russia several times, but that hasn't stopped the armies, Air Force, navies in certain cases, of the clash. So let's not give the opportunity to potential foes, of which there's more today than there were 10 years ago. And they're more dangerous today than they were 10 years ago, and they're more likely to use force than they were 10 years ago. Let's not give them the opportunity to engage in conventional war or nuclear war by having a strong deterrent posture, which means your troops have to be ready, which means they need capital to buy the stuff, they need people to man the stuff, training systems to actually get ready on the stuff so that they can go overseas and do some good. And of course, the last thing you need is the support of the population. And that's where you come in.
Hey, today's editorial or article in The Economist called our defense spending miserly. And we've all seen the Wall Street Journal story, or their editorial, which was not particularly kind, and said it was too bad there wasn't a junior card table to kind of set at the NATO meeting because of our inability and unwillingness to spend. We've been left out of AUKUS. We're marginalized in NATO, and I don't think there's any question about that. American policy gurus are talking about maybe it's time to kick Canada out of the G7, and they mean it. And they're talking about replacements. They're talking about South Korea. They're talking about Poland. As recently as yesterday, they were talking about Australia. So we have a real problem in terms of our perception. I think people were prepared to give us the benefit of the doubt because of our performance in World War I and World War II, and just recently in Afghanistan, where we punched above our weight, and we really, held the line when others weren't prepared to go and hold that line. But we're in a bad spot. The Canadian forces have been neglected by a series of governments, and to one degree or another. And now we have to put up. And, the government has signed on to the 2% commitment to spend 2% of GDP as the minimum of defense spending. And as the general says, we give back $1 billion plus a year every year that we either lapse or don't spend, or sometimes $3 billion. And we're supposed to see a big infusion of cash this year. And if it happens, I'll be quite properly ecstatic. But, so far we haven't seen that. And there's a lot of things that we could do rather than give back money. And I think the general knows, we did it in Afghanistan. We did foreign military sales, and we could pick up anti-tank rockets off the shelf, or anti-aircraft, small anti-aircraft stuff tomorrow. We could get counter-drone capability tomorrow if we were willing to spend the money. But so far, we haven't been willing to spend the money. And I'll cite two examples. Strategic drone, RPAS, has been waiting to be awarded for about a year and a half. There's only one qualified platform in the competition. We don't need to know anything more. We just need to go out and actually sign the contract and buy it. And when there's only one aircraft in the competition, or one airframe, you're not in a position to leverage that and to push ITBs, because the company has no reason to do that. And we have the same thing with the tanker and tactical transport aircraft. One qualified player still left. It was the same with F-35 at the end of the day, and there was foot dragging on that. And now the government said they're going to buy some F-35s, but we could fill the bins with spare parts and ammunition tomorrow if the government was willing to do that. And I think the government should be willing to do that, because as the Globe and Mail said, to make the commitment and then not to move forward on it, it's unconscionable. And I think we're going to pay a price. We're going to pay a price with our allies. And one day Canada may not be a part of the G7. And what are we going to do then?
On behalf of the Samuel Associates and Policy Insights Forum, I'd like to thank General Andrew Leslie and Mr. Joe Varner for their valuable insights on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the implications for the future. Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Joe.